If you love someone with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, that's what you mean. I'm ready to do whatever that person is pleased with. Whatever he desires or she desires, I'm ready to do. Isn't that what it means? And what does God desire to do? You say you love God. What does God desire you to do? He says, love your neighbor. Therefore, if you're not loving your neighbor, if you're hating your neighbor and saying you love God, it's a lie.
Offer my life to you, everything I've been through. Use it for your glory, Lord. I offer my days to you, lifting my praise to you as a pleasing sacrifice. Lord, I offer you my life. All that I am, all that I have, I lay them down before you, oh Lord. All my regrets, all my joy and the pain, I'm making them yours. Lord, I offer my life to you, everything I've been through. Use it for your glory. Lord, I offer my days to you, lifting my praise to you as a pleasing sacrifice. Lord, I offer you my life. Things in the past, things in the past, things yet unseen, wishes and dreams that are yet to come true. All of my hopes and all of my plans, my heart and my hands are lifted to you. Lord, I offer my life to you, everything I've through. Use it for your glory. Lord, I offer my days to you, lifting my praise to you as a pleasing sacrifice. Lord, I offer you my life. Lord, I offer you my life.
John puts it like this again. He has already taught it all this time. He puts it like this: we love him, or we love. I like that translation. We love because he first loved us. Otherwise, we won't be able to love at all with this kind of love. We love because he first loved us. This is the gospel. This argument is based on the gospel. He came. He loved us when we were sinners. He put this love in us. Therefore, we are having the capacity to now love God and love others, he says. Verse 20, the second argument is more interesting. He says, if someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? Now, this is also another verse I'm sure a lot of Christians are familiar with. I've been familiar with this for a long time, because when you read the New Testament, you come across all these verses. These are very heavily used verses, right? And once again, the problem is whether we have understood it right, whether we understand anything about it at all, and do we understand it right? What is he saying here? He says if someone says I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. He's really using very strong words here. He's a liar. You can't say you love God and not love your brother and hate your brother. Then that person is a liar, he says. Why? He puts it logically, common sense knowledge. He says, for he who does not love his brother whom he has seen. If you cannot love someone who you see, how are you going to love someone you don't see, which is God? It's a common sense argument. First, he put the argument based on the gospel. Second, he puts the argument based on common sense. He says, how are you going to love a God whom you cannot see when you can't even love the brother whom you can see? Now, this verse presents a couple of difficulties. A lot of people are not able to agree with John's teaching here. And so they say things like this. Let me put forth these two main objections to this. One is, they say, how can you say something like this? How can you say that if someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar? He's literally saying that you cannot love God without loving your brother. If you say you love God, then you must love your brother. If you say you love God and you hate your brother, you are a liar. You cannot love God and hate your brother. The two things do not go together. So if a person says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. It's not true. So people say, how can that be true? That is too harsh a judgment. And they say, just think instinctively. Just listen to your heart and make the judgment, they say. They say, when you think instinctively, you realize that it is easier to love God than to love others. Why? It is easier to love God, for one thing, because God is perfect. He's no problem. He's got no shortcomings. He's not a difficult person. He is not an irritating person. He hasn't got that kind of a personality. God is not bad. He's good. He's perfect. He's kind. He's merciful. He's loving. If all the biblical descriptions of God are true, then God is such a wonderful person. Naturally, you want to love that person. You'd like to be with that person. You want to love that person. It's easy to love the person. Plus, on top of that, he's someone you can't see. Very convenient. Don't we tell some people? I think we better stay away from each other, then we'll love better. Right? How many of you told that before? I think we better not see each other, because if we see each other too often, we can't love. Let's stay out of the way of each other. Then if we stay out of the way, out of sight makes us love better. It works better. We think out of sight helps us love better. So God stays out of sight. You can't see God. So no complaints. He's not bothering me every day. I can't see him. He's not an irritating person. He's not a bad person. He's not an imperfect person. But consider the brother. They can be sometimes the most irritating people. Consider the one who's living with you. Consider those around you and in your house and your family and your friends. They can be some of the most difficult people, you know. Sometimes you wish you were not born in this family. Sometimes you wish you didn't even know this guy or this sister or whatever, you know. Because they're such difficult people. No justice, no sense of mercy, no kindness, no decency, no sense of any kind of decency. And you say, how can I ever love such people, you know? So it becomes very difficult to love a brother. Easy to love God. So what people say is, what John is saying is totally unreasonable. Instinctively speaking, if you just think about it plainly, your heart will tell you he's wrong, John is wrong. He's saying, if you love God, you must love your brother. If you love God and hate your brother, you are a liar. But they say it is possible to love God because it's easy to love God. You can't see him and he's good. And hate your brother because he's such a nuisance. So it is possible for a person to love God and hate his brother. What's wrong with that? After all, I love God. That's what matters. I hate this guy because I don't like to see him. He's irritating. I don't want to get in front of him. I don't want to see his face. But I love God. Just think about it. You can love God while you're hating your brother. It's possible. John says you're a liar. John says if you're hating your brother, you are not speaking the truth. You are not loving God, he says. If you say you love God, you hate your brother, you're not loving God. You're saying a lie about your love of God, he says. They say that is unreasonable. That argument cannot be accepted, they say. The second objection, I'll give you the answer for that. You just have to wait a couple of minutes. The second objection is this. It's more biblical objection. First is a common sense objection. Objection that comes from instinctive thinking. Second objection is a common sense objection. The common sense objection goes like this. They say, wait a minute. John says, you start loving your brother, then you get promoted to loving God. Loving God is something greater. Loving your brother is something lower than that. So you start loving your brother, then you start loving God. They say that's wrong. Because Jesus said, you first love God, then love your brother. Is exactly the opposite of what Jesus taught. They're producing a biblical objection. Turn with me to Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22. Where does Jesus say that? Let me read from verse 35. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him. So they're always trying to test him to catch him at his word, whether he'll make a mistake with his words. Now, you're not going to catch Jesus making a mistake with his word. James chapter 3, verse 2 says, a man can err in so many ways. He can go wrong in so many ways. But if he errs with his words, the one who does not err with his words, he is the most perfect man, right? If you don't commit a blunder with your words, you're a perfect man. Now, Jesus is a perfect man. He doesn't mess up with words. He never had to say something and say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I just blurted out. It just came out of me, Never, never. As people, we're always having to say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, It just came out of me. We're imperfect, He's perfect. His words are perfect. You can never get him at his word. If you're trying to test him at his word, then you got the wrong person. You're going to fail every time, So this lawyer comes here and asks Jesus this question, They found that he silenced all the Sadducees, so the Pharisees showed up. They said, let's test him. Let's get him. One of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him, saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Now, this guy knows, the commandments and all that. But he wants to ask a tricky question. He wants to make him choose one law out of the 10 laws, 10 commandments. Which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, see, if he chooses one, he can immediately catch him and, show him that he is wrong and so on. Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. What Jesus is saying is all the 10 commandments are important, basically. Where does he say that? You may say, well, brother, he's only talking about 2 commandments now. What happened to the 10 commandments? He got rid of 8 of them. He's got only 2 here. No, he simply divided the 10 commandments into 2 things. 2 ways he classified it. The first 4 commandments of the 10 commandments having to do with loving God, your relationship with God. The last commandment, the next few commandments, all the way to the end, is about loving one another. So the commandments, the 10 commandments, if you take and analyze, it's got 2 major sections in it. One is loving God and loving others. So he says the first and the great commandment is that you love your God, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That's the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. Second is like it means that second is also great. The second is equally great. And the second is just like the first one. He doesn't differentiate anything. The second is like it, he says. A lot of people ignore that, The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. Not only the 10 commandments, he says, the entire Old Testament, the law and the prophet refers to the first 5 books of the Bible, the law, and the prophets refers to the rest of the books of the Old Testament. The law and the prophets, this is the essence of it. The essence of the law and the prophets of the Old Testament is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. So the people say, these objectors say, look, Jesus is saying like this. He says, first you love the Lord your God, and then you love your neighbor. But John says, first love your brother, then we'll know that you love God. What Jesus is saying, he is reversing the order. John has reversed the order. How can we answer these two objections? Now, the first thing is this. John does not teach here that we must start by loving our fellow men and women and then advance from that to loving God. That is not what he is saying in 1 John chapter 4, verse 20. He doesn't say, first love your brother, then you can get promoted to loving God, because that is greater. Doesn't say that. Read what he says. Don't force words into his mouth, trying to interpret it. You read what he says. A lot of times Christians are putting words into the Bible. They're writing another Bible, The thing must be to bring out what is in there, never to insert something in there. If you start inserting, you'll be in trouble. That is not Christian preaching. You start bringing out, then you'll receive the benefit. You just start receiving what it says, understanding what it says. What does it say? John did not say what they think. They think he says, first love your brother, then you can go on to loving God. No, he never said that. Look at what he says. If someone says, I love God and hate his brother, he is a liar. For he who does not love his brother whom he has seen, how can he love God whom he has not seen? This is what John says. He says, I love God and hates his brother. He's a liar. That's what he's saying. He's not saying you love your brother, then you'll go on to love God. If you're successful in loving your brother, then you can be promoted to loving God. No, he never said that. He says, if a man says, I love God and hates his brother, he's a liar. A better way to explain that is this. There is no way to separate the two commandments. Loving God and loving your neighbor. The two commandments cannot be separated. That is the meaning of what Jesus said when he said the second commandment is like it. It's just like the other one. There's basically no difference, he says. Otherwise, why would he put that line there? The second commandment is just like it. Just like the first one, he says, no different. You say, well, brother, it's different. The first one is loving God. Second one is loving the brother. It's not different. I'll show you how it's not different. Even though for argument's sake, intellectually you can separate the two commandments, really, you cannot separate the two commandments. It's not practical at all to separate the two commandments. That's why Jesus said the first commandment is this, that you love your God, Lord your God, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And the second commandment is just like it is. Just like this one. It's basically the same, he says. It means you cannot separate it. Even though he mentions it as a second, it is joined with the first because it's just like the other one. And he says, love your neighbor as yourself. I'll show you how the two belongs together and you cannot separate. For example, if you say, I love God just like the Bible says, just like Jesus said. I love him with all my heart, my soul, with my mind. What does that mean? It means that you're ready to do whatever he says. In my understanding, I think in your understanding also, love and loving somebody with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind means that you are ready to do anything that that person desires and wishes. You're ready to please that person whichever way possible. Am I right? If you love someone with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, that's what you mean. I'm ready to do whatever that person is pleased with. Whatever he desires or she desires, I'm ready to do. Isn't that what it means? And what does God desire to do? You say you love God. What does God desire you to do? He says, love your neighbor. Therefore, if you're not loving your neighbor, if you're hating your neighbor and saying you love God, it's a lie. It is not possible to love God when you're hating your brother. Since you love God, since you say you love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, then you must follow it with loving your neighbor. Because that's what he wants, that's what he desires, that's what will please him. That's the only thing that will satisfy him. Jesus said in John chapter 14, verse 21, he said, if any man love me, he will keep my commandment. If a man loves me, he'll keep my commandment because he loves me. He will do what I say. So you love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Do what he says. What does he say? He says there's only one other thing he says. He says, love your neighbor. He says, love God, love your neighbor. So if you don't love your neighbor, then to say that you love God is a lie. The two cannot be separated at all. In this way, the two commandments are joined together inseparably. It cannot come apart. Both are linked with one another. It is impossible to love God and desire to please him without loving the brethren, because that's what God desires from us. So you can't separate the two. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. The two are together. If you love God, you'll love your neighbor. Because if you love God with all your heart, you'll do whatever God wants. And this is what God wants. You love your neighbor. He says, apart from loving God, there is only one other commandment, that is loving the neighbor. So, if you're not going to do this, then you're not doing the first one. You're a liar, it says, when you say you love God and you hate your brother. So John is right when he says that. But look at the very strong words he uses. He's a liar, he says. The man who says, I love God but hates his brother is a liar. Why does he put this matter in such strong words? He's got some other things also going on in his mind. Now, just like these days, and always it's been in the New Testament church, there have been heresies and false teachings that have been spreading among the church. It's the devil's job to spread all kinds of wrong teaching inside the church to divert the people away from the main issues and divert the people away from the truth and living for God, to make them somehow unsuccessful. One of the tricks that the devil has used from the very first century itself, the later part of the first century itself, is to bring in a trend towards mysticism. Now, you know what mysticism is. Practically, mysticism works out like this. For example, when it comes to love, mysticism makes love a matter of sentiment and feeling. So a person who's into mysticism will say, well, I want to experience the love of God. I wanted to experience the love of God, so I went into the woods. I went separately, away from this world. And I shut myself in that forest, in that woods. And I stayed there, didn't eat anything. And I'll tell you, about the fourth or the fifth day, the love of God was just poured on me. I was so drenched, and I was swimming in love, and I was so filled with God's love. It was just poured out on me, and I had this wonderful experience. Now, I'm a total Pentecostal, You need to have no doubt about it. I believe all these experiences. It's no problem for me. If a man comes and confesses that this is what he experienced, really, I have no problem, because I believe that people can have experiences like that. I have known people having experiences like that. It is quite possible that a man has an experience like that. But if you reduce love to a sentiment or just a feeling and say love is nothing more than that sentiment and feeling, that I don't go for. Love is not just a sentiment and feeling. Love is not where you say, I felt this and I had this and I was flying up there in the air for 5 days or I was swimming in the river of love for 5 days and you give me all these wonderful descriptions. That's fine. I understand your feelings. I understand your experience. But if you say this is what love is, then I don't think I will go for it, because love is not a sentiment or a feeling. It is something more. It is practical.
Through you, I can do anything. I can do all things, 'cause you give strength. impossible.